The stone tower stood silent in the center of the cabin, radiating heat into every corner, while outside the wind screamed at 50 miles per hour and snow fell so thick a man couldn't see his own outstretched hand. Lars Eriksson sat at his wooden table, warm enough in just his wool shirt, watching through the frost-rimmed window as the blizzard tried to kill everything in the valley below. 3 miles down the mountain, trappers were burning their furniture, their tool handles, their hope, desperately feeding roaring fires that consumed a winter's worth of wood in days, while their cabin stayed brutally cold. But Lars's small fire had died 6 hours ago, and his cabin was still warm, would stay warm until morning, and the modest stack of firewood against his wall would last another week, even if the blizzard never stopped. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories of frontier survival and forgotten ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale of mountain innovation is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1842 came to the northern Wyoming Territory with unusual cruelty. By mid-January, temperatures had dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Lars Eriksson and Peter Calloway had been trapping partners for 3 seasons, working the beaver streams in the Wind River Range. They were competent, careful, and prepared. Their cabin was standard construction for the era. Logs chinked with moss and mud, a stone fireplace against the north wall, a single door, 1 small window. It had served them adequately through 2 previous winters. But the cold snap that began on January 14th tested everything. The temperature dropped to 30 below, then 35, then 40. The stone fireplace consumed wood at an astonishing rate. Lars and Peter had stockpiled what they thought was sufficient fuel, a cord and a half stacked outside near the cabin door. Within 5 days, half of it was gone. The mathematics of survival became brutally clear. The fireplace required feeding every 2 to 3 hours to maintain even minimal warmth. Each feeding consumed 4 to 6 pieces of split wood. The heat radiated outward in a narrow cone, warming perhaps 8 feet of space directly in front of the hearth. The rest of the cabin remained cold enough to see breath. At night, they slept in their fur robes as close to the fire as safely possible, and still woke shivering. Peter volunteered to make the wood runs. Someone had to go outside every few hours to bring in more fuel from the dwindling stack. He would bundle himself in every piece of clothing they owned, push through the door into the killing cold, load his arms with wood, and stagger back inside. Each trip took perhaps 5 minutes, but 5 minutes at 40 below zero, repeated 6 to 8 times daily, accumulated damage. By the 8th day of the cold snap, Peter's fingers showed the gray-white patches of frostbite. By the 10th day, he was moving slowly, his speech slightly slurred. Lars recognized the signs of hypothermia, but there was nothing to be done except keep the fire burning and hope Peter's body could recover warmth. But keeping the fire burning meant more wood runs, and Peter insisted on continuing to make them. On the morning of January 24th, Peter went outside for wood and didn't come back immediately. Lars found him collapsed 6 feet from the cabin door, arms still wrapped around a load of firewood, unconscious. Lars dragged him inside, stripped off his frozen clothing, wrapped him in both their fur robes, built up the fire as hot as the hearth would allow. Peter never regained consciousness. He died that evening while Lars sat helplessly beside him, watching the fireplace consume another load of wood, feeling the cold air seeping through gaps in the chinking, understanding with perfect clarity that his partner had frozen to death, not from lack of shelter or fuel, but from a heating system so inefficient it had killed him. Lars buried Peter on a hillside overlooking the creek they had trapped together. The ground was frozen, 18 inches deep. It took him 2 days to dig the grave, breaking the earth with a pickaxe, prying out frozen chunks of soil. He marked it with stones and returned to the empty cabin alone. The cold snap broke 3 days after Peter's death. Temperatures rose to an almost comfortable 10 above zero. Lars sat in the cabin and calculated. He counted the remaining firewood, less than a quarter cord left. He estimated how much they had burned, more than a full cord in 16 days. He thought about the heat that fireplace had produced and how little of it had actually warmed the cabin. The fireplace was 12 feet from where he slept. The stone absorbed some heat, but most went straight up the chimney. He could hold his hand near the hearth opening and feel intense warmth. 3 feet back, the heat dropped noticeably. 6 feet back, barely perceptible. The cabin had a cold corner near the door where ice formed on the interior walls, despite the fire burning constantly. Peter had died keeping that fire fed. Had died making trips outside that were necessary only because the fireplace consumed fuel so wastefully. Had died because the standard frontier heating solution was fundamentally flawed, and neither of them had questioned it. Lars became obsessed. He studied the fireplace with new attention. He measured the opening, the depth of the firebox, the width of the chimney throat. He burned single pieces of wood and watched where the heat went, mostly up. Some radiated forward. Almost none stayed in the cabin for more than a few minutes after each piece finished burning. He finished the winter alone, rationing his remaining wood carefully, accepting cold rather than burning through his supply. When spring came and the beaver streams thawed, he worked his trap lines mechanically and his mind elsewhere. He visited other trappers' camps within a day's travel. Every cabin had the same fireplace design: stone or mud brick, large opening, big chimney. Everyone accepted the same inefficiency because it was traditional. In late April, Lars traveled to Fort Bridger to sell his winter's catch of pelts. The trading post had a massive stone fireplace that consumed whole logs. It kept the main room barely warm. Lars talked to an old French-Canadian trader who mentioned stone stoves he had seen in Quebec, massive structures that burned small amounts of wood but held heat for hours. The trader couldn't describe the construction in detail, only that they worked better than fireplaces. Lars returned to the mountains in May with a new purpose. He would not trap that summer. He would experiment. He would figure out how to heat a cabin efficiently enough that no one else would freeze to death feeding a wasteful fire. He owed Peter that much. He owed himself survival. He began, gathering stones from the creek bed, selecting them carefully, testing their weight and shape, beginning a process of trial and error that would consume the next 6 months of his life. Lars spent the summer of 1843 conducting experiments that other trappers would have considered insane. He built small test structures near his cabin, crude miniature versions of heating systems, trying to understand how stone absorbed and released heat. He was not educated in physics or engineering. He had only observation, patience, and obsessive focus. His first experiments were simple. He heated different types of stones in his campfire and measured how long they stayed warm. He used no thermometer, only his hand held close to the surface, counting minutes until he could no longer feel radiated warmth. Granite cooled quickly, limestone held heat longer. But the smooth river stones from the creek bed, worn round by centuries of water flow, retained warmth longest of all. He tested size. Small stones heated quickly but cooled quickly. Large stones took longer to warm but held heat for hours. He began selecting stones obsessively, walking miles along the creek, gathering only those that met his emerging criteria: flat surfaces top and bottom for stable stacking, roughly circular shape, diameter between 8 and 16 inches. Weight he could lift and position precisely. By mid-June, he had gathered more than 300 suitable stones, sorted by size, stacked near his work area. He began building test structures. His first attempt was a simple stone ring around a fire pit, 3 feet in diameter, 2 feet high. He built a fire inside, let it burn for 2 hours, then extinguished it. The stones radiated gentle warmth for 6 hours afterward. The principle was clear. Stone mass absorbed heat. More mass meant more absorption and longer retention, but a simple ring was inefficient. Heat escaped upward too easily. He needed to contain and channel it. His second design added a top, creating a stone dome over the fire. This was better. The dome trapped heat more effectively. But smoke had nowhere to go. The fire smothered itself. He needed airflow, a way for smoke to escape while keeping heat contained. He experimented with openings: a hole at the top of the dome for smoke, a larger opening at the base for fuel and air. Fire burned cleanly now, and the dome structure held heat for 8 hours. Progress, but not enough. 8 hours would not sustain warmth through a full night in deep winter. He tried different stone arrangements: single layer, double layer, triple layer. Thicker walls absorbed more heat, but took longer to warm. He tested gaps between stones versus tight fitting. Gaps allowed heat to escape. Tight fitting held it better. He learned to shape contact surfaces, grinding stones against each other until they seated nearly flush. By August, Lars understood the fundamental principles: maximum stone mass for maximum heat storage, efficient combustion chamber for complete fuel burning, contained structure to prevent heat escape, openings sized correctly for airflow without excessive loss. He needed to scale these principles up to cabin size. He needed to build something no mountain man had ever attempted. A stone tower, early September 1843, brought the first hints of coming winter. Lars began construction on what neighboring trappers would soon call his madness. He had selected a new cabin site on higher ground with better drainage and clear sight lines. The cabin itself was secondary. The stone tower was everything. Isaac Drummond stopped by on September 10th. Isaac trapped the territory 15 miles west and occasionally traveled through Lars's area. He found Lars sorting river stones into precise piles organized by size, hundreds of them arranged on the ground in careful rows. Isaac watched for several minutes before speaking. "What exactly are you building, Lars?" "A monument to your dead." "Partner? That is a lot of stone for a fireplace." "Not a fireplace," Lars said without looking up. "A heating tower. Going to build it 8 feet tall, straight through the cabin roof." Isaac laughed. "It will fall over before you get it 4 feet high. Stone needs mortar. You cannot just stack rocks and expect them to stand." Lars said nothing. He had heard similar opinions from 2 other trappers who had passed through. Their skepticism did not concern him. He had spent 3 months testing stability, learning how weight distributed through stacked stone, understanding compression and friction. He knew it would stand. The foundation was critical. Lars dug down 2 feet below the frost line and filled the pit with smaller stones packed tightly together. This created a solid base that would not shift or settle. On top of this foundation, he began placing his largest stones, each weighing 40 to 60 pounds, forming a circle 5 feet in diameter. The first course of stones took an entire day to position correctly. Each stone had to be placed with its flattest surface down, tested for stability, adjusted until it sat firmly without rocking. The gaps between stones were minimized through careful selection and placement. Lars had learned that tight fitting was essential for structural integrity and heat retention. The second course overlapped the first, each stone bridging the gap between 2 stones below, creating an interlocking pattern. This was the principle he had observed in stone walls and brick construction during his youth in Ohio. Each successive layer locked the previous layers in place through distributed weight. By late September, the tower base stood 3 feet high. Lars had moved beyond the widest section and begun the gradual taper inward. Each course was slightly smaller in diameter than the one below. The mathematics were intuitive rather than calculated. He simply ensured each stone was supported by the mass beneath it, angling inward at a rate that felt stable when he tested it by pushing hard against the structure. Isaac returned in early October. The tower was now 4 feet high and showed no sign of instability. Isaac stopped mocking and started asking questions. "How do you know where to put each stone? How do you know it will not collapse when you light a fire inside?" Lars finally looked at him. "I know because I tested it." October brought cold nights and the urgency of approaching winter. Lars worked from dawn until darkness made stone placement impossible. The tower had reached 5 feet, and the most critical engineering challenges were becoming apparent. He needed to create an internal flue system while maintaining structural stability. The fire chamber at the base was designed as a deep cavity, 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, with an arched opening facing into what would become the cabin interior. Lars had built this chamber by carefully arranging stones to form the walls and back, leaving the front open for fuel. Loading. Above this chamber, the internal flue began. The flue was not a simple straight shaft. Lars had learned from his summer experiments that hot gases needed contact time with stone mass to transfer heat efficiently. A straight vertical opening would let heat escape too quickly. Instead, he created a spiraling pathway by positioning stones to form internal baffles, partial obstructions that forced rising smoke and hot gases to take a longer route upward. This internal architecture was invisible from outside, but critical to function. Each stone in the middle and upper sections had to serve double purpose, contributing to external structural stability while also forming the internal maze of channels. Lars worked by feel and intuition, occasionally lighting test fires in the unfinished tower to observe smoke patterns and adjust his design. By mid-October, the tower stood 6 feet high. The taper was becoming more pronounced. The base had been 5 feet in diameter. At 6 feet of height, the diameter had narrowed to 3.5 feet. Lars maintained this gradual reduction by selecting progressively smaller stones and positioning each course slightly inward from the one below. Robert Chen visited on October 18th. Robert was a Chinese immigrant who had come west 5 years earlier and established himself as a skilled trapper despite facing prejudice from some in the mountain community. He and Lars had developed mutual respect based on competence rather than words. Robert walked around the tower twice, studying it from all angles, saying nothing. Finally he spoke. "This will work," he said simply. "The others think you are crazy, but this will work. Stone holds heat. I remember from my grandfather's house in Guangdong, stone oven, very efficient." Lars felt validated by Robert's understanding. Someone else saw what he was attempting. They discussed heat retention principles, comparing notes on what Robert remembered from his childhood and what Lars had learned through experimentation. The tower continued rising, 7 feet, 7.5. At 8 feet, Lars positioned the final courses that would penetrate through the cabin roof structure he had already framed. The top of the tower narrowed to 20 inches in diameter, forming the chimney outlet. On November 2nd, Lars placed the final stone. The tower stood complete. 8 feet of carefully stacked river stones, tapering from 5 feet at the base to 20 inches at the top, weighing over 1,000 pounds, held together by nothing but gravity, friction, and precise engineering. Now came the test. On November 5, 1843, Lars lit the first fire in his stone tower. He had spent the previous 2 days completing the cabin structure around it, ensuring the roof properly sealed around the tower's upper section where it penetrated through to the outside air. He used small kindling and a modest amount of split wood, building the fire slowly in the base chamber. Smoke immediately filled the cabin. The draft was wrong. Smoke poured out of the fire chamber opening instead of rising through the internal flue. Lars opened the door and window, letting the smoke clear, analyzing the problem. The fire chamber opening was too large relative to the flue diameter. Air took the path of least resistance, flowing out the front rather than up through the narrow internal channels. He let the fire die completely. Then he repositioned stones around the fire chamber opening, making it smaller, reducing it from 3 feet wide to 2 feet wide. The change altered the airflow dynamics. When he lit the second test fire that afternoon, smoke hesitated at the opening, then began drawing upward into the tower. But the draft was weak. The fire burned sluggishly. Smoke still leaked into the cabin, though less than before. Lars studied the problem through the evening. The internal flue pathway was too restrictive. His baffles, designed to maximize stone contact for heat extraction, were creating too much resistance. Hot gases could not rise efficiently. The next morning, Lars partially dismantled the upper 4 feet of the tower. It was painful to undo weeks of work, but necessary. He repositioned stones to create a more open internal channel while maintaining some baffles for heat extraction. The balance was delicate. Too open, and heat escaped without warming the stone mass. Too restrictive, and smoke backed up into the cabin. The third test fire on November 8th was better. Smoke drew cleanly up through the tower. The fire burned hot and efficient. But Lars noticed uneven heating. The side of the tower facing the fire chamber became very hot, while the opposite side remained barely warm. Heat was not distributing evenly through the stone mass. He made another adjustment, repositioning stones in the lower section to create secondary channels that allowed hot gases to spiral around the interior before rising. This forced heat to contact more stone surface area. The modification took 2 days. On November 12th, Lars conducted the comprehensive test. He built a moderate fire using 6 pieces of split wood. The fire burned for 2 hours. Smoke drew perfectly through the tower with no cabin backup. The entire tower surface warmed evenly. When the fire died to coals and then ash, Lars tracked the heat retention. 2 hours after the fire died, the tower was still too hot to touch. 6 hours later, warm to the touch. 10 hours later, pleasantly warm. 12 hours later, still radiating gentle heat. 14 hours after the fire had gone out completely, Lars could still feel warmth emanating from the stone mass. He had done it. December arrived with light snow and temperatures dropping into the teens at night. Lars established his heating routine. Morning fire at dawn, evening fire at dusk. Each firing used 5 to 7 pieces of split wood and burned for approximately 2 hours. The stone tower absorbed the heat and radiated it steadily for 12 to 14 hours. The overlap between morning and evening firings kept the cabin consistently warm. He calculated his fuel requirements. 2 firings daily, 6 pieces average per firing, 12 pieces per day. A cord of wood contained roughly 450 pieces when properly split. 1 cord would last approximately 37 days. For a 4-month winter, he needed 3 1/4 cords. He had cut and split 4 cords to provide margin. Other trappers in the region were stockpiling dramatically more. Isaac Drummond had 8 cords stacked outside his cabin. William Hayes, who trapped 20 miles south, had accumulated 10 cords. They needed that much because their fireplaces consumed wood continuously. Lars's tower required less than half their supply for superior warmth. The difference was remarkable. Lars visited Isaac's cabin on December 15th. Isaac's fireplace roared with a fire built from logs 8 inches in diameter. The area, directly in front of the hearth, was almost uncomfortably hot, 10 feet back, cold enough to see breath. The cabin corners were frigid. Isaac wore heavy wool coat and fur hat indoors. Isaac looked at Lars, who wore only a cotton shirt and light wool vest. "How is your stone tower working?" "Still standing?" "Working perfectly," Lars said. "Cabin stays warm all day and all night from 2 small fires, using maybe 1/3 of the wood you are burning." Isaac was skeptical but curious. "Show me." They traveled to Lars's cabin together. The evening fire had died 3 hours earlier, but the tower was still radiating warmth throughout the interior. The temperature was comfortable in every corner. No cold spots, no drafts. The stone surface was warm enough to rest your hand against without discomfort. Isaac examined the tower closely, asking detailed questions about construction, draft, heat retention. He was impressed but not ready to abandon his traditional fireplace. "Building something like this would take weeks," he said. "Winter is already here." Lars understood. Most trappers would not change until forced to by crisis. On December 20th, a trader passing through from Fort Laramie stopped at Lars's cabin. The trader had news from the eastern settlements. Weather patterns were unusual that year. Unusually heavy snow in the mountains, unusually cold temperatures across the plains. Old-timers were predicting a brutal winter, possibly the worst in decades. The trader asked about Lars's stone structure. "Never seen anything like that." "Does it work?" Lars fed the evening fire 6 pieces of wood and invited the trader to stay the night. By morning, the trader was convinced. He spread word at every camp and fort he visited afterward. Norwegian trapper up in the Wind River built himself a stone tower that heats better than any fireplace. The description was accurate. The timing was perfect. 3 weeks later, the blizzard struck. January 9th, 1844 began with gray skies and falling barometric pressure. By noon, snow was falling heavily. By evening, the wind had risen to a howl that made the cabin walls creak. By midnight, it was clear this was not a normal storm. Lars fired his evening routine at dusk, 6 pieces of wood burning for 2 hours in the tower's base chamber. The stone mass absorbed the heat as always. He banked the coals, closed the fire chamber, opening partially with a flat stone to reduce draft, and prepared for night. Outside, the world disappeared into white chaos. The blizzard intensified through the night. Wind speeds exceeded 50 miles per hour. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to 0. The temperature plummeted to 30 below 0, then kept falling. 40 below. The cold was deadly, absolute, the kind that killed exposed flesh in minutes. Lars woke at dawn on January 10th. The cabin was still comfortably warm. The tower radiated heat steadily. He could hear the wind screaming outside, but inside was calm and protected. He lit his morning fire, another 6 pieces of wood, and settled in to wait out the storm. By the second day, it was clear this was no ordinary blizzard. The snow had not stopped. The wind had not diminished. The temperature remained brutally cold. Lars could hear sounds carrying on the wind from down the valley. Chopping. Desperate, constant chopping. Other trappers cutting wood, burning through their supplies at catastrophic rates. Standard fireplaces in these conditions consumed fuel at triple the normal rate. The extreme cold and high winds created drafts that pulled heat up chimneys even faster than usual. Trappers were feeding their fires constantly, every hour, burning massive logs just to maintain barely survivable temperatures in their cabins. Lars burned his 2 small fires per day and stayed warm. His 4 cords of split wood stacked inside the cabin within arm's reach of the tower would last 2 months at this rate. He had food, he had water from melted snow, he had warmth, he never needed to open the door. On the 4th day, he heard shouting from the direction of William Hayes's cabin, desperate voices calling for help that never came. The wind swallowed the sounds. No one could travel in these conditions. No one could see 10 feet. Going outside meant death. On the 6th day, the chopping sounds from Isaac Drummond's direction stopped. Lars felt cold dread. Either Isaac had retreated inside permanently, or something worse had happened. The blizzard continued. Day 7. Day 8. Lars maintained his routine. Morning fire, evening fire, the tower radiating steady warmth between. He spent his time checking and rechecking his trap equipment, sharpening knives, doing small tasks to keep his mind occupied. Outside, the world was trying to kill everything. Inside, he was warm. On day 9, the wind finally began to diminish. On day 10, the snow stopped. On January 19th, the storm ended. Lars opened his door. The silence, after 10 days of howling wind, was eerie and absolute. Lars stepped outside into a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted 15 feet high against the north side of his cabin. The entire valley was buried under a blanket of white that reflected the morning sun with blinding intensity. The temperature had risen to 0, which felt almost warm after the depths of the blizzard. Lars strapped on his snowshoes and began the difficult journey down to check on his neighbors. The snow was deep and soft, making travel exhausting. He headed first toward William Hayes's cabin 2 miles south. It took him nearly 2 hours to cover the distance. He found William alive, but barely. The cabin door was gone, burned for fuel. The window frame was gone. 2 of the interior wall benches were gone. William sat huddled in furs next to a dying fire, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had owned. His woodpile outside, 10 cords that should have lasted all winter, was completely gone. He had burned it all in 10 days. William looked at Lars with hollow eyes. "How did you survive?" "I burned everything. Everything. I was going to start on the floorboards next." Lars helped William build up his fire using wood from his own emergency supply, gave him food, and promised to return with more supplies. Then he continued toward Isaac Drummond's cabin 3 miles northeast. He found Isaac frozen to death inside his cabin. The scene told the story clearly. Isaac had run out of firewood on approximately day 6 of the blizzard. He had burned his furniture. He had burned his door. He had wrapped himself in every fur and blanket he owned and huddled in the corner. The cold had taken him anyway. His fireplace, even burning constantly, had not been able to keep the cabin warm enough. The thermodynamics were simple and brutal. Heat escaped faster than the fire could produce it. Lars stood in the frozen cabin for a long moment, looking at Isaac's body, thinking about Peter, thinking about how many men had died, because frontier heating was fundamentally inadequate for extreme conditions. He found 2 more trappers dead in cabins within a 5-mile radius over the next 2 days. One had tried to go outside for wood and frozen 30 feet from his door. Another had died like Isaac, in his cabin, out of fuel, unable to maintain heat. Robert Chen had survived. Lars found him on January 22nd. Robert had been more resourceful than most, rationing his wood carefully, burning smaller fires, accepting cold rather than exhausting his supply. But his cabin was frigid and his woodpile nearly depleted. Robert looked at the modest amount of wood Lars had brought on his sled. "You have more? After 10 days?" How? The stone tower, Lars said simply. Uses 1/10 of the wood, holds heat for hours. I never came close to running out. Robert was silent for a moment. Teach me to build one. Spring came late in 1844. When the snow finally melted in April, Lars helped Robert Chen build the second stone tower heating system in the Wyoming Territory. They worked together for 3 weeks, selecting river stones, stacking them with the precise technique Lars had developed. Robert learned quickly, understanding the principles of thermal mass, taper, and internal flue design. William Hayes watched the construction and asked Lars to help him build a tower that summer. Word spread through the surviving trapping community. The Norwegian who built the stone tower that kept him warm during the blizzard of the century. Men who had mocked Lars a year earlier now sought his knowledge. By fall of 1844, 6 more trappers had built stone towers using Lars's method. Each installation was slightly different, adapted to individual cabin dimensions and available materials, but the core principles remained constant. Wide stable base, gradual taper, internal flue system for heat extraction, thermal mass sufficient for 12 to 14-hour retention. The towers became known by various names. Some called them Ericsson Towers after Lars. Others called them Norwegian stoves, assuming the technique came from Lars's ancestral homeland, though Lars had invented it himself through experimentation. A few called them survival towers, recognizing their purpose plainly. The winter of 1845 was mild by comparison to the previous year, but the stone towers proved their worth again. Trappers who had built them used a fraction of the firewood consumed by those still using traditional fireplaces. The fuel efficiency alone justified the weeks of construction time required. Over the next decade, the technique spread throughout the northern Rocky Mountain region. Traders carried descriptions to other territories. Trappers taught other trappers. The design evolved through small innovations as different builders added their own improvements, but the fundamental architecture remained Lars's contribution. Lars himself continued trapping until 1852, then moved to the Montana Territory and established a small ranch near what would later become Missoula. He married in 1854 a widow named Catherine who had come west with a wagon train. They had 3 children. Lars died in 1876 at age 62 of pneumonia, surrounded by family who knew him only as a quiet rancher who had once trapped beaver in the mountains. He never sought recognition for his heating innovation. He never wrote down his technique or claimed credit. He simply built something that worked and shared the knowledge freely with anyone who asked. But the stone towers remained, scattered across the wilderness, some still standing decades after their builders had moved on or died. Modern historians estimate that Lars's design saved between 30 and 50 lives over the 20 years following the blizzard of 1844. Men survived winters that would have killed them with standard fireplaces. The exact number is unknowable because survival leaves fewer records than tragedy. But the towers themselves stand as monuments, silent, functional, efficient. Proof that sometimes the most important innovations come not from educated engineers, but from desperate men who refuse to accept that traditional methods are the only methods and who build solutions stone by stone.